If I asked you who you thought the most influential woman in the history of beauty was, who would you say? I'm sure there are a few different names that come into mind. There have been a lot of incredible and successful women in the beauty industry over the years and decades, but I think a lot of people would say the one that stands out the most is Elizabeth Arden, and I can see why. From being born in a poor Canadian family to pioneering many beauty products and practices that are now commonplace, building a beauty empire that dominated the industry and becoming one of the wealthiest women in the world. Elizabeth Arden's story is fascinating and full of drama. It involves stealing a business partner's name, marching with the suffragettes, surviving 2 world wars, marrying a Russian prince, and playing her part in one of the greatest rivalries in the history of beauty. Her life was definitely anything but boring. Today's video is a long one, so get comfortable, watch this in parts. We have a lot to go through. She lived a very colourful life. So how exactly did a poor Canadian farm girl become one of the most successful, most powerful women in beauty? Chapter 1, Florence Nightingale Graham. Well, let's start with her name, shall we? Because she wasn't born Elizabeth Arden, she was born as Florence Nightingale. Now, before you get carried away, let's get excited. We're not talking about that one. Florence Nightingale did not have another life as a beauty empress, but the famous nurse was a hero to Arden's mother, and so she named her daughter Florence Nightingale Graham. Florence was born on her family's small farm in Ontario, Canada. When she was born, though, kind of seems up for debate. It seems to be widely agreed that she was born on New Year's Eve, but what that year was is the confusing part. At various times, Florence and later as Elizabeth Arden claimed different dates of birth on official documents, like her marriage certificate, which says she was born in 1883, and a passport application 5 years later, which says she was born in 1886. However, her own brother signed a statutory declaration saying that Elizabeth was born in 1881, a claim which was supported by census records at the time. So that seems the most likely year that she was born, though apparently her birth record seems to have disappeared, so we'll never know for sure. Whatever year it was, Florence was born, and she was born to a Scottish father, a Cornish mother, who had both emigrated to Canada. Her father, it seems, had a lot of different jobs, including being a bookkeeper, a grocer, and a peddler. One of those people who kind of went around with a cart back then, going from place to place selling simple things, bric-a-brac, pots, pans, ribbons, lace, needles, small books, so on, all those things you find in the junk drawer. But when Florence was born, he seems to have been working as a market gardener, growing what fruit and vegetables he could on their relatively small farm and selling them at nearby markets. None of his careers brought in that much money though, and with a wife and 5 children to feed, it meant that Florence and her siblings grew up relatively poor. Things got even worse when Florence was just 6 years old and her mother passed away from tuberculosis. It put a lot of strain on the family, both of course emotionally and financially, and as a result her father turned to alcohol, apparently a little bit too much. The family managed to get by for a while, but eventually their circumstances meant that Florence and her siblings had to pick up a lot of the responsibility, and Florence herself had to leave high school before she'd finished in order to start working. What jobs she did back then isn't entirely clear, but we do know she eventually worked as a bookkeeper, for a little while a secretary, and later as a dental assistant. The dental assistant job is often discussed as one of the first signs of her skills in business and marketing. It's said that not long after she started the job, she was helping with the dentist's finances, given her experience in bookkeeping, and she realized that if things kept going the way they were going, she'd be out of the job soon, because the dentist wouldn't have enough money to pay her. So instead of just looking for a new job or hoping things would turn around for the business, she convinced the dentist to let her write to all his customers, where she explained why regular dental checkups were important, and heavily implied that horrible things would happen to their teeth if they didn't get them checked regularly. That scheme apparently worked. Worried patients started coming in for checkups, and within a year, she had apparently managed to double the dentist's revenue. Later, in her mid to late 20s, Florence started studying as a trainee nurse, but it didn't last long. Apparently, nursing wasn't for her, and after a short while, she decided that she didn't like being around all the blood and human suffering every day, so she dropped out of nursing school. So she may not have followed in her famous namesake's footsteps, but she did go on to become one of the most successful and wealthiest businesswomen in history. So that's not too bad either, I suppose. She did something right. Her training as a nurse wasn't completely wasted though, as it was apparently during this time that she met a chemist who was experimenting with a facial cream that could help acne sufferers. The concept intrigued her and helped develop her interest in beauty. After leaving nursing, she apparently tried to start a mail order business, marketing her own version of the face cream. This business allegedly failed, at least in part, because her father had very little patience for her schemes. He wanted her to get married, as women were expected to back then, become a mother, etc. Florence was almost 30 at this point, which was considered quite old to still be unmarried back then, but she was adamant that she didn't want to marry yet because she was afraid she would lose her independence, which she probably would have done. So instead, she left Canada and set off for New York in 1908. When she arrived, she started working as a bookkeeper again, this time for a pharmaceutical company, E.R. Squibb. A lot of sources say that although she wasn't involved in the production side of things, working at the company still exposed her to their scientific way of doing things. She was allegedly impressed with the company's state-of-the-art laboratories and their constant attention to research and development. And supposedly this gave her the idea of combining beauty with more scientific methods. How much truth there is to that though is questionable, as she only worked at the company for 10 days before quitting. Instead, she went and started working for Eleanor Adair, I want to say, who was a well-known beauty culturist, as they called it back then. Florence wanted to learn more about beauty, and Adair's salon was the place to do it in New York. It sounds like she did a lot of different things actually whilst working for Adair, with her role at different times being listed as treatment girl, cashier, receptionist, assistant, or secretary. So she probably learned quite a lot about the beauty business while she was there. She learned how to do facial massages, how to mix the creams and lotions, and how to give manicures, as well as learning how to deal with customers, manage appointments, sell products and treatments, and just how the beauty business worked back in those days. The cosmetics industry was only just getting started at this point, at least in the US, and at the most, cosmetics were made by hand at home, rather than being manufactured and sold by a brand en masse. Salons like this were the first to make cosmetics into something like more professional, something more glamorous. And Florence learned very quickly. Once again, she wasn't there for very long, leaving after about a year because she decided she wanted to have a go at running her own beauty salon. Florence didn't have the money herself to fund the business though, so she went into partnership with Elizabeth Hubbard, who would provide the money. Hubbard's name would also be the one to be emblazoned on the shop window in big gold letters, partly because she was the one paying for most of it, but also because they decided that putting Florence Nightingale would be very confusing for customers. At the end of 1909, they set up shop on New York's expensive Fifth Avenue, something Hubbard wasn't too happy about given that they could barely afford the rent there, but Florence apparently insisted on it. She knew right from the start that she wanted to target the luxury market, and the right premises were important if they wanted to do that. This is partly why the partners ended up fighting though, because Florence had an expensive vision for the salon. Only the highest quality of everything would do, but Elizabeth Hubbard was the only one funding it all. Their arguments over finances led to Hubbard abruptly ending the partnership just a few months later, leaving Florence to pay the huge rent and run the salon herself. Chapter 2: The Birth of Elizabeth Arden. Hubbard's departure was definitely a massive blow to Florence's dreams of running a successful beauty salon, but in the long run, it would obviously work out for her, partly because it meant she was now the sole owner of the business, but also because this is when Elizabeth Arden was finally born. The salon Florence was left still had Elizabeth Hubbard's name written in gold letters across the window, and money was so tight. So in order to save money on a new sign, Florence decided to start using the name Elizabeth for business. That way, she'd only have to pay a sign writer to change the surname on the sign, rather than both names. It's also believed that she decided to do this to annoy her former partner, as they didn't really get along at this point. I love the pettiness there. And as we'll see in a moment, that idea might not be too far-fetched. As for the new surname, nobody is like 100% certain where Elizabeth I'll start calling her Elizabeth from now on, got it from, as she doesn't seem to have ever really confirmed it. Some say that she got it from a poem by Tennyson called Enoch Arden, while others suggest she got it from the obituary of railroad baron Edward Henry Harriman, who died around that time. The story of his death was circulated very widely, and it included the fact that he had a large estate nearby called Arden. Wherever she got it from, Florence Nightingale Graham had now become Elizabeth Arden, and that name would soon become one of the most recognised names in the whole world. But that was still to come. Right now, things were tough for Elizabeth Arden. There was no way she could afford the rent on her own salon, never mind any of the other business expenses her grand plans would require, so she ended up having to borrow $6,000, which was a lot of money at the time, from her brother William. I don't know how he had it. She also worked as a manicurist whenever the salon was closed during this time in order to supplement her income. This was also around the time when she came up with the idea of total beauty, which basically meant that a woman could come in and get everything done she needed in one place. Elizabeth also brought in a hairdresser, a milliner, someone who designs and makes hats, to share her salon space. Not only did it bring in more customers, but the hairdresser and milliner were paying rent to Arden, which made it easier for her to afford her own rent on the building. Things quickly started turning around for her. She'd positioned her salon as a high-end beauty parlor, naming it Salon d'Oro, which is a mix of French and Italian to make it sound more upscale and more European. Back then, it was common to put the name of the business as well as your own name as the owner on the front of the building, which is why she also had Elizabeth Arden written on the window. She didn't change the name from Elizabeth Arden to Salon d'Oro, it was all there. This is also when she first painted the door of her salon bright red, something that later became synonymous with the brand. She did this because she wanted to catch the eye of people on the street, hopefully bringing in more customers. It was a clever move and it actually worked. Within 6 months, the business was flourishing and Elizabeth had made enough to pay back the loan from her brother. A lot of this early success is said to be down to Arden's skill at performing the treatments that she offered, as well as her ability to sell. One of the hairdressers that worked out of the salon apparently said the way she could sell and the way she could train other girls to sell, it was astonishing. This, it appears, is the real secret behind Arden's success, both at the start and later in her business. She knew what women wanted and she knew how to sell it to them. She also started advertising right from the start as well, which likely played a big part in her early success. She spent large amounts of money promoting her salon, her products in magazines and newspapers. She targeted middle-aged and plain women who she thought were the most likely to want her services. Early ads focused on getting women to buy her products by mail order, and they focused on her Venetian pore cream and her Venetian eyelash grower. She also put a lot of stress on teaching women how to properly apply makeup, as well as including detailed instructions for skincare routines in her adverts for both a bedtime routine and a morning routine. It wasn't necessarily the products themselves that were making the brand so successful though. Early products and treatments were basically copied from what she'd learned and used working with Eleanor Adair. What became her signature treatment at her new salon was basically a rip-off of one of Eleanor Adair's treatments. Arden called it muscle strapping. It involved using leather or fabric straps to press, shape, or massage someone's face to allegedly improve all sorts of things. One ad Elizabeth Arden ran at the time said that the treatment smooths out lines and wrinkles, lifts up sagging muscles and flabby skin, firms, whitens, refines its texture, restores outline of youth, produces bloom and color by stimulating circulation, removes blemishes, reduces pores, reduces double chins, and in all ways creates and restores beauty of skin and contour. Now that sounds like some bullshit to me. I mean, for the time it was fine, but for one thing, it says at one point it whitens the skin. Was this the time when everybody wanted to look like they were dying? I think so. But then it also goes on to say that it produces color by stimulating circulation. But it was apparently very popular with women at the time. So I guess there have always been beauty scams around forever. She did also start experimenting with new ideas for cosmetics though. One particularly good idea was to add fragrances to her lotions, creams, and powders. Before that, cosmetics usually had no scent or just smelt like all the ingredients it took to make that product, you know? She kind of came up with the idea of fragrances in cosmetics, at least in the US. It might not always be seen as a good thing today, but it was definitely innovative at the time. This helped to set Arden's products apart slightly, but it wasn't enough for her. What she really wanted was to create new products that would completely differentiate her from her competitors. Aside from just wanting to create new and better products, Arden also had another reason for developing a new line. One of the problems Arden had back when her business partner left was that she'd shared all the formulas, treatments, and products with her former partner, Elizabeth Hubbard. After their partnership fell apart, Hubbard carried on selling the same beauty products and treatments herself from her own salon. Arden was apparently furious about this, despite the fact that she had done the exact same thing to Eleanor Adair. At the time, Hubbard was known for describing her expensive lotions and powders as Grecian in order to make them sound more prestigious and alluring. So Arden decided to take a similar approach, likely in part to annoy her former partner, choosing to call her new line of products Venetian. But like I said, Arden didn't just want to play petty games over the names of products. She actually wanted to create something completely new, something better than what was currently available. So in 1912, she actually traveled to France to learn about new beauty products, facial massage techniques used in Parisian beauty salons, as well as to learn the trends that European women loved so that she can take them back to the American market. She returned with samples of ingredients and products, as well as new ideas of what beauty could be. She started with the fact that she thought the creams and lotions available at the time were too heavy and greasy, and she asked her supplier to make one for her that was light and fluffy. They told her that it was impossible, so she started to look for someone else to do it for her. Finally, in 1914, she met A.F. Swanson, who she hired to make this new cream for her. Despite the task supposedly being impossible, he managed to do it pretty quickly, and Cream Amaretta was born. Next, he created Ardena Skin Tonic, which became an instant success for the brand. In fact, it sold so well that it was difficult to keep up with demand. Swanson helped her create almost all of her products in those days, including creating a new line of products that consisted of various creams, skin tonics, muscle oils, and even a bleaching cream. It was around this time that World War I started, and although it definitely had an impact on supply chains, it actually helped make the US a global economic superpower, which was good for Arden because it meant Americans had more money to spend on cosmetics. Now, there was another benefit, I guess you can say, to the war for Arden and for her business though. This was all well before women in the US had the right to vote, or really many rights at all. It was a time when not many women worked, and even fewer were in charge of their own companies. But it was also a time when makeup was far more stigmatized, especially in the US. In Europe, makeup was already seen as a high-class status symbol, but it was a very different story in the US. It was seen as a low-class thing that was only done by sex workers and actresses, prostitutes as they called them at the time. But when World War I started and women started gaining more independence, doing jobs that only men did before, and a lot of social taboos started to weaken. This was something Arden was strongly in support of. She'd been involved in the suffragette movement for years by this point, with some sources even saying that on one march she was part of, she supplied the 15,000 suffragettes with red lipstick, which became an informal part of their uniform, as well as becoming a symbol of female emancipation. So Arden made sure to help push this trend and to capitalize on it. She started a marketing campaign to change the view of beauty products in the US, especially makeup. One of the things she brought back from her trip to France was the idea of using eye makeup, which was popular among high society in Paris, but it took a while for American women to get on board. At first, this was just a step too far for them, but during the war, and in large part due to Arden's marketing campaigns, more and more women started trying eye makeup from Arden salons, which is why she's often credited as the first person to introduce eye makeup to the US, at least successfully. She's widely regarded as either almost single-handedly or at least playing a huge part in transforming makeup into something that was essential for being seen as ladylike and professional for all women in the US. So despite World War I happening, Arden's business was flourishing by 1915, just 5 years after launching. She had 2 successful salons, the original in New York and another that had recently opened in Washington, D.C. Her products were sold in multiple high-end department stores throughout the US. And she had a team of cosmetics working for her, creating new and innovative products. Things were going very well for Elizabeth and her business, but until now, she hadn't had much real competition, at least not in any major way. That was about to change though. She was about to enter into one of the most talked about rivalries in the history of cosmetics. Chapter 3: The Rivalry begins. While Elizabeth Arden had been busy creating her already hugely successful business, another woman on the other side of the world had been doing the same. When Helena Rubinstein arrived in the US in 1915, opening her first US salon in Manhattan, she'd already had over a decade of experience running a beauty business back in Australia. She had become very successful in Australia with her Valet's skin cream and had added more and more products to her lineup, whilst expanding to Europe with salons in London and Paris, all before Elizabeth Arden had even opened her first salon. Arden was understandably worried from the start when Rubinstein arrived. Rubinstein had established an international cosmetics brand that would provide a direct threat to Arden's dominance up to that point. This was on another level from the Eleanor Adair's and Elizabeth Hubbard's, whose businesses were tiny in comparison. Arden wasn't one to wait around and see what happened though. She responded immediately, first by moving her own flagship New York salon just blocks away from Rubinstein's new salon. The move put her in a more fashionable area of Fifth Avenue and in a better position to steal customers from her new competitor. This move seems to have kicked off a rivalry that lasted decades, involving product copying, staff poaching, personal jabs at each other, and just constant attempts to get the better of each other. If one of them came out with a popular new cream or lotion, the other would quickly bring out something that was suspiciously similar. If one opened a new salon in a prestigious neighborhood, the other copied them soon after. It was a back and forth that got extremely petty at times, even spawning multiple books about the rivalry, as well as a stage play which ran in 2017. Before we get too ahead of ourselves though, Arden wasn't done trying to consolidate her place as the leading beauty brand in the US. Moving salons was all good and well, but it would take far more to keep ahead of Helena Rubinstein. One big advantage that Rubinstein had over Arden at that point was that she had successful salons in 3 other countries. Her business had already gone international. It was time for Elizabeth Arden to do the same. So in 1915, for the first time, Arden began selling her products outside of the US. It would take time for her to open her own salons, but for now, she got her products into high-end department stores in France and in the UK. But it wasn't all business for Arden in 1915, as that was the year she married Tommy Lewis, a former banker who she'd actually met years earlier when she applied for a bank loan to expand her business. Then again, on the boat on her way back from her trip to France. The marriage finally gave Arden American citizenship. Not that there are any suggestions that was the reason that she did it, like she wasn't doing it for a green card. Her new husband started working for her pretty much immediately, heading the wholesale division of her company. He was considered to be very good at his job and helped Arden continue to grow and to compete with Rubinstein, who hadn't wasted any time expanding her reach in the US. By 1920, the Elizabeth Arden brand was selling their products in over 5,000 drug and department stores around the world. And in the same year, Arden continued her European expansion, opening her own salons in Paris in 1920 and in London the following year, following those up with salons in Madrid, Rome, Berlin, Cannes, and Biarritz in the next few years, before expanding out to South America and Australia shortly after. Thanks to both Arden and Rubinstein, by 1925, barely 15 years after Arden opened her first salon, American women were spending over $6 million a year on cosmetics, and the Elizabeth Arden brand made over $2 million that year, meaning they accounted for a 1/3 of all cosmetic sales in the US. That is crazy. Things continued to grow from there for Elizabeth Arden. By 1929, the brand had over 150 salons throughout the US, as well as selling her products in 22 different countries. So it's no surprise that Arden apparently received an offer to buy her business outright in 1929 for $15 million. Despite being encouraged by friends and relatives to just take the money, particularly because the Great Depression in the US had just started, Arden refused the offer. She hadn't achieved her grand vision yet. She had a worthy rival pushing on her, and there was so much more to be done. Chapter 4: The Peak of an Empire. As it turned out, it was a very good decision. Despite exceptions, the brand flourished during the Great Depression. In 1930, they were employing more than 1,000 people and grossed more than $4 million a year, doubling compared to just 4 years earlier. During this time, they also established new factories in London, Paris, Berlin, Toronto, and Mexico, capitalizing on her ever-expanding international success. In 1930, Elizabeth Arden also launched arguably the most successful and one of the most iconic products in the brand's history, and in beauty of all time, the 8-Hour Cream Skin Protectant. It's a simple looking balm that heals, soothes, and protects the skin. According to countless customers over the decades since its launch, it works. It does. It's good. It is still the brand's best-selling product to this day, and it's earned an endless list of celebrity fans, including Jennifer Aniston. Jennifer Aniston? I just realized it's always in these videos. She loves everything out there. Don't take Jennifer Aniston's word for anything. Victoria Beckham, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Zendaya, and even royalty like Princess Diana and Queen Elizabeth II. The product alone helped boost the brand's revenue massively, and the next few years alone were incredibly successful. They followed that success up with innovative new lipstick products in 1932. Until then, they'd only really come in like a few basic shades, and their lipstick kit, which contained several different shades, was a big hit during the Depression, creating a sensation in the industry that Arden's competitors scrambled to imitate, like Kylie Jenner's lip kits. In 1934, she established her first beauty spa in Maine. It was a huge success, unsurprisingly. Women would pay $500 a week to go in order to lose weight and be slathered in Elizabeth Arden products. Her philosophy was that modern beauty is not a veneer of makeup, but intelligent cooperation with nature to develop a woman's finest natural assets. She had a way with words. They prescribed a regime of exercise, treatment, swimming, and riding, all while on a strict diet that ruled out fatty foods and alcohol. Despite these restrictions, the spa was hugely popular. She even opened another one years later, and over the years they attracted so many women from high society circles, including actresses, writers, socialites, and the wives of several politicians. Because of all this success, Arden decided to move their New York flagship store again, this time to a location that made it the largest beauty salon in the US. Sources close to Arden said that she did this partly just to annoy Rubinstein, almost as a way of rubbing in the fact that Arden had pulled ahead as the leading beauty brand at the time. Not everything was perfect for Arden during this time, however, with her personal life becoming turbulent, something that Rubinstein would soon capitalize on. Around 1933-34, it's reported that Arden's husband had a failed bid to take over the company. He'd also apparently been having affairs with several women who worked for the company, even using the company car to take them out on dates. After separating for around a year, Arden unsurprisingly divorced her husband in 1934. Reports claimed that her husband, who had played a huge part in helping her grow over the last 2 decades, continued working for her at first. But apparently, to taunt Arden, Helena Rubinstein decided to hire her ex-husband soon after their divorce to be her new sales manager. It was a petty move that undoubtedly hurt Arden, both personally and professionally, but Arden had the perfect opportunity to retaliate just a few years later. In 1937, she allegedly lured Helena Rubinstein's general manager, Harry Johnson away by offering him a huge sum of money, $50,000 a year, which would be the equivalent to well over $1 million a year in today's world, to come and work for her. Johnson was apparently very good at his job and had helped Rubinstein improve her brand's declining profits in the 4 years he had worked for her. His sudden loss threw the brand into chaos and forced Rubinstein to scramble to find a replacement. The rivalry was getting increasingly petty and bitter by this point, but by the time the Second World War started, Elizabeth Arden had established itself as the industry leader in cosmetics. They had salons all over the world and a wide range of products being sold, including makeup, skincare, perfume, soap, bath salts, and even toothpaste. Even the war couldn't derail the brand's success. During this time, Elizabeth Arden concentrated on expanding their reach into the domestic market, seeing as the war meant a loss of many overseas markets. It worked perfectly. Up until then, Elizabeth Arden products had been available in their own salons and in prestigious department stores across the country. But during the war, they decided to expand into all the major drugstore chains around back then. It was a move that not only kept the brand going during a really difficult time in the world, but it made them bigger than ever in the US. Arden also had a stroke of marketing genius during the war. You see, Rubinstein had won the contract with the US Army to supply specialized military kits containing camouflage colored face paints, sunscreens, and salves for burns. It was a huge win for them and worth an absolute fortune. This deal could have easily seen Rubinstein's brand become dominant if Arden didn't do anything. So she struck a deal with the US Marine Corps Women's Reserve to supply them with an official custom-designed cosmetic kit featuring a vibrant shade of lipstick called Montezum Red, alongside matching nail polish and cream rouge. The bright red color was meant to match the red hat cords, scarves, and chevrons of the women's service uniforms. It was a huge success, unsurprisingly. Rubinstein may have been supplying camouflage to men in the army, but that didn't relate to sales with their core audience, women. They didn't care. Arden's deal meant that suddenly women in the Marine Reserves all over the US were wearing her products. And the lipstick in particular became so popular that they also released a version for the general public called Victory Red shortly after. Nobody else was as good at marketing products as Elizabeth Arden during that time. What a genius. A lot of their products were actually made of really simple ingredients. The incredibly popular Ardena skin tonic, for example, was just made of water, grain alcohol, boric acid, and perfume. And another of their very popular early products, her muscle oil, was just cheap castor oil and water. What made these products sell so well and what made Elizabeth Arden so successful was her understanding of marketing and packaging. She created an image around herself, around her brand, and her products that implied luxury and good taste. And this high-class image is something that many have said Arden had always wanted ever since she was young. She'd always wanted to be seen as part of high society, despite her very humble beginnings. Her success as a businesswoman had helped her achieve this in many people's eyes. But to some, it was her next marriage that really cemented her position in the world, at least briefly. In 1942, Arden married a man named Michael Evlenov. He was a Russian immigrant who claimed to be a prince with a large income from a trust in his name. Many thought that Arden purposefully chose a prince because Rubinstein had actually married a Georgian prince a few years earlier. But unfortunately, the marriage was quite messy, turbulent, and very brief. Evlenov, if that's even his real name, as it turned out, was a con man. Not only did he apparently invite his boyfriend on their honeymoon, he also lived an extravagant lifestyle, expecting Arden to pay for all of it, as his trust payments were delayed. And a private detective eventually found out his royal title was fake. This is the Nigerian prince scam, isn't it? Just not an email. They separated after just a few months together and got divorced in early 1944 after only 14 months. Despite her relationship troubles, the war, and her rivalry with Rubinstein, or perhaps because of it, the early 1940s were a good decade for Elizabeth Arden's brand. But the end of World War II saw things getting even better for her, not the world, with the brand going from strength to strength, and Elizabeth Arden herself being recognized by many for her huge success. In 1946, she was featured on the cover of Time magazine in a story about her success in the male-dominated world of cosmetics and horse racing. Now, she had always loved horses, and after setting up her own horse racing operation in 1943, she'd already been pretty successful by that point, obviously. The very next year, though, in 1947, one of her thoroughbreds named Jet Pilot won the Kentucky Derby, which is a big deal in horse racing, apparently. I mean, even I recognize that name. She also launched a clothing line in the 1950s, and Elizabeth Arden became the first brand in the industry to target male customers by launching men's fragrances and opening a men's boutique. It was the first boutique for men launched in New York in 1956, shortly before launching the Arden for Men product line. Some of the more popular products from the men's line were the fragrances, obviously for men, Sandalwood in 1956, which became a signature scent of Frank Sinatra, and Arden for Men Citrus Wood. By this point, the rivalry between Arden and Rubinstein had died down somewhat, but not completely. It wasn't quite as intense as it had been for the several decades before. This wasn't because either of them had suddenly liked the other, but more so because they were no longer the only ones providing any real competition. The 1950s and 60s saw both Revlon and Estee Lauder become big players in the US beauty market, and a lot of Arden and Rubinstein's energy turned towards defending their positions against these huge newcomers. Charles Revlon in particular was a nuisance for them, with his strategy of just outright copying anyone else's successful products as soon as they came out. Chapter 5, the end of an era. This shift in dynamics between the major players in the beauty world was arguably the end of an era for the two women, and their brands that had dominated the industry for so long. It seems a shame to think that despite so many years at the top together, despite being in the same industry together, in the same business circles, the same social circles, living and working in the same city, down the same street, despite their similar backgrounds, building themselves and empires from nothing, and building the beauty industry as we know it today. Despite all of that, they never managed to put aside their differences. In fact, they apparently never even met in person. In many ways, their lives and careers ran parallel to each other. They both started in a beauty world fairly close together. They both found success around the same time, at least in the US. They fought back and forth for 50 years to be on top. They struggled against rising competition at the same time, and they both passed away around the same time. Helena Rubinstein passed away in 1965, and Elizabeth Arden died just over a year later in October of 1966. If the rise of competitors like Revlon and Estee Lauder didn't spell the end of an era, then the passing of two of beauty's most important and most successful pioneers certainly did. When Elizabeth Arden died, her brand had more than 100 salons worldwide, and a line of around 300 cosmetic products that was sold in 44 different countries. The brand was also reported to be bringing in around $60 million a year at that time, and the cosmetics industry as a whole in the US had grown into a multi-billion-dollar business, and Elizabeth Arden played a huge part in that. After her death, the company was never really the same. The sales numbers may have gone up as the beauty industry as a whole continued to explode, but even when the brand was making over 10 times what they did at the end of Arden's life, their cultural relevance and position in the beauty world never reached the same heights ever again. Joseph F. Ronchetti took over as president and CEO of the brand after Elizabeth Arden's death, and by all accounts, he did a pretty good job. He was one of the few constants at the brand over a very turbulent few decades. In 1971, the company was bought by Eli Lilly for $38 million. The brand was sold again to Faberge in 1987, who then sold it to Unilever in 1989. Under Unilever, with Ronchetti as CEO, the brand had some big successes, including launching their now iconic Red Door fragrance in 1989, named after the signature red door of the brand's early salons. Then came their capsule serums in 1990 that were a big innovation at the time. There was nothing else like that on the market. 1991 saw Elizabeth Taylor's White Diamonds become the #1 selling fragrance of that year. It was technically part of Taylor's own signature brand, but the scent was created, produced, and distributed in partnership with Elizabeth Arden. It was another huge success for the brand, helping to restore some of the glitz and luxury that they had been so well known for. Unfortunately, that was the last real high point for Elizabeth Arden. Ronchetti eventually resigned from his position as president and CEO of Elizabeth Arden in 1992, with many agreeing that he successfully found a new audience for the brand. According to a New York Times article, under Ronchetti's leadership, the brand had gone from a line for grandmothers into a brand that younger career women wanted to wear. At this point, Elizabeth Arden was estimated to have revenues of around $1 billion a year, but just a few years later, after Ronchetti stepped down, things seemed to have fallen apart rapidly. Reports said that their gross margins had been eroded and inventories were obsolete. Industry estimates at the time put the brand's profit margin at around 4%, which is incredibly low. One of Unilever's other prestige brands at the time, Calvin Klein, was estimated to have profit margins of around 20% for comparison. And the sales that had reached $1 billion in 1992 were said to have dropped to just $850,000 by 1995. That's still a lot of money, but it's a very significant drop, and sales continued to fall after that, with the brand's image starting to lose its prestige and sense of luxury, partly because of its prominence in the mass market stores like JCPenney and Sears. Things improved slightly over the next few years, largely due to the success of their new fragrance Splendor, but it wasn't enough, and by 2001, annual sales for the brand was said to be around $819 million, slightly better than 1995, but not as good as the early 90s. So Unilever finally decided to cut their losses and sell the brand once again. They also said that they felt that Elizabeth Arden no longer fit into their more fashionable cosmetic lines. They sold the brand to French Fragrance Inc. in 2001 for what seems like a ridiculously low sum. $225 million. And in a move that would probably outrage Elizabeth Arden herself, given her hatred for Charles Revlon, in 2016, the brand was bought for $870 million by Revlon. Today, the brand still has its diehard fans, usually older, wealthier women. People love buying the 8-hour cream at the airport and duty free, but overall, Elizabeth Arden is struggling to compete in today's beauty market. Over the last 60 years since Elizabeth Arden passed away, her namesake brand has unfortunately suffered a fairly steady decline in popularity and recognition, especially amongst younger consumers. Having once been the biggest beauty brand in the world, Elizabeth Arden is now just a subsidiary of Revlon, who themselves come nowhere close to being the biggest beauty brand around these days. Chapter 6: Elizabeth Arden's legacy. Despite the somewhat disappointing state of the brand today, Elizabeth Arden's legacy is one that won't be forgotten anytime soon. She may have only been around 5 foot tall, but she was a powerhouse of the beauty world, an incredibly talented marketer and innovator. She introduced and helped popularize so many trends that we take for granted today. She was the first to introduce eye makeup to women of America, the first to make travel-sized products, the first to offer makeovers in stores and to men. She started putting fragrances in beauty products before many of her competitors, and she played a huge role in popularizing and normalizing the use of cosmetics in the US. Once she'd done that, she also pioneered the idea of coordinating the color of your eye, lip, and face makeup, as well as being a strong advocate for the combination of cosmetics and science to produce better products. She created a highly successful international business empire all before women even got the right to vote, and then she helped them get that vote. The beauty world as we know it today just wouldn't be the same if Elizabeth Arden hadn't led the way for so many women that came after her. And unlike many others in the beauty industry, she did it all without bullshitting her way through the industry. Her skill lay in the way she marketed her products, her boutiques, and herself. She was someone who knew exactly how to market to people, but especially to women, and she wanted things done exactly how she envisioned them because she knew it would work. According to sources close to her, she insisted on personally giving the final sign-off on all the ads her brand ran, and she came up with the names for most of the products herself too. There are also stories of her apparently insisting on having the bows on packages retied again and again until they looked exactly exactly right, that she'd spent months sniffing half a dozen sachets of perfume a day in order to find the exact perfect scent, that she required perfection in everything to do with her business. Her expectations made her difficult to work with in some ways, with turnover in her salons known to be very high. One competitor apparently said work for Elizabeth Arden and live in a revolving door, reinforcing the fact that a lot of her employees just didn't last very long. But while it may have made things difficult for some employees, her standards are what made her brand so popular with customers. And for those who could meet her standards, she was apparently very generous, and many of her employees became fiercely loyal to her. One of her very first employees, Florence Delaney, there are a lot of Florences back then apparently, started out as her bookkeeper in those early days, later rising to become treasurer and director of the company, as well as manager of the New York salon. And A.F. Swanson, who was the chemist that helped her create so many of her hit products, stayed with her for over 40 years. She was also known to employ a much larger percentage of women in her company compared to others, and the wages and salaries she paid to her employees were also said to have led the way in the industry in general. Again, this was at the time when a lot of women weren't working, and if they were, jobs just didn't pay them very well. Working for Elizabeth Arden, if you could live up to the perfection she demanded, quite toxic, provided a livable wage to many women who then didn't have to rely on getting married in order to survive. Elizabeth Arden did a huge amount for women in many different ways, and yes, she did profit from doing so. That Time magazine article I mentioned earlier said about her, Elizabeth Arden has made femininity a science and probably earned more money doing so than any businesswoman in history. At her peak, she was undoubtedly one of the wealthiest women in history. She even bought a 12th century castle in Ireland and spent 5 years and millions of dollars restoring it before her death. She was the original Enya, but the fact that she made a ridiculous amount of money from all of this doesn't negate the fact that she changed the beauty world forever and changed the lives of countless women in the process. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. I mean, there's so much more I could still talk about when it comes to Elizabeth Arden, but this video is getting very, very long, and I think I covered most of the important points, so I'm gonna stop here. Let me know, what do you think of Elizabeth Arden and her story though? I think it's somewhat underappreciated nowadays. Did you know about all the modern beauty norms that she helped popularize? Do you have a favorite Elizabeth Arden product to this day, or do you only know about the 8-hour cream? But most importantly, has anyone seen the play about Arden and Rubinstein's rivalry? Was it any good? I kind of want to see it. I don't know. Anyway, hopefully I'll see you next time.